What's up, everybody? What's up, Craig? Welcome to, I'll say, like, the Northwood Equinox 2024 edition of Why Am I Like This? If you haven't tuned in before, or you haven't listened to a recording of Why Am I Like This before, or you haven't listened to the Broom Radio before, then welcome to this container. There are some nice people here. We have some lemon tea. We have some cinnamon, if you'd like to stir that into your tea. We have some raw organic honey. I would say like harvested from pollinators who've interacted with a plant consciousness called jarrah, which is a type of tree here in Bolo, Perth, Australia. And we don't always have these amenities available, but today we do. And I'll say, Why Am I Like This is a container which I created maybe in the last year or so. Because, yeah, I'm somebody who's active on social media. I'd say it's like one of the battlegrounds of what some people sometimes call the spiritual war. And it's also a marketplace of thought forms or ideas. And in order to introduce people to the things I talk about, I talk a lot on social media. And I would say like social media has sort of indoctrinated us into this idea that the work that people do on social media is free. And I would say that's only partially correct. I would say that for the people who are consuming it, they don't have to pay money for it a lot of the time. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily free because they're spending their space and time to consume this stuff. And I don't think this is something that people necessarily understand, because often the opportunity costs are unquantified, which is to say that they're not necessarily conscious of what they might be doing otherwise and the value of doing those other things. I would say it's not free for me to produce content on social media because the opportunity cost is pretty high in my case, because I used to work as a software engineer, and software engineers make a lot of money in current time. They probably make way more money than I was making when I was a software engineer 4 years ago. But yeah, around 4 years ago, I would say, steered pretty erratically off of the path of being a software engineer to do this work. So the opportunity cost for me to produce this work on social media is pretty high. And I would say another sense in which the work on social media is not free is that in order for most of us to interact with it, people who are also software engineers, but also non-software engineers who work in what are usually referred to as tech companies, like product managers, user experience designers, office managers. There's people who maintain the buildings that they work in. There's people who maintain vital internet infrastructure like data centers, fiber optic cables. There's people who make Wi-Fi routers, laptops, etc. So I take my work on social media very seriously. But I would say that sometimes people ask me questions thinking that the work is free. And if you're listening to this in current time, I'd say you're probably listening to it without paying any money. But I would say that the value of this work is higher from my perspective, because instead of just answering the questions in the containers in which they're asked to me, A, I'm able to transmit something which is more comprehensive. B, it tends to be more useful and often goes beyond the scope of the question or the intention in which the question was asked. And then C, I would say more people get to see it as a result of it. So while I'm still not getting paid usually directly for the stuff I'm doing with Why Am I Like This, I would say it's adding value to more people's lives when I bring it into this container. And when I say it's adding value, I'm not saying that it necessarily puts money in their bank accounts or cash in their wallets. But I'm saying that from my perspective, when people listen to Why Am I Like This, uh, they they can go about their lives with more freedom and more sovereignty. And I would say that perception ends up being formed within a slightly less karmic accumulation of spirit. And dot, 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 I feel like when people are truly free, not necessarily just free in the sense of like not having to labor within authoritarian structures, but I'd say when people are truly free to say vibrate without coercion and without constraint with the song of the universe, then the song of the universe gets better. I would say, like, if you listen to someone playing music and their instruments out of tune, then usually it sounds kind of awful, depending on what they're trying to play and their level of skill. And sometimes, depending upon their instrument and whether it has discrete keys. But ultimately, I feel like this is like a servable metaphor for what I'm trying to do with Why Am I Like This? And I would say what many of us are trying to do with the Broom Radio. And um, if you would like to make donations to me or the Broom Radio so that we can keep on providing value to people who can't always necessarily pay or won't always necessarily pay, then you can see the links in the description of this episode. Um, Hopefully in like not too much time, you'll be able to go to thebroom.us and find out how to support the Broom on a one-off or on a recurring basis. Um, but yeah, I guess like I feel complete when it comes to like plugging Why Am I Like This and the Broom Radio and also uncompensated labor on social media. And I'll just like step into it. Um, so the question I felt called to bring into this episode today is a question that comes from Adam Archetype, who is a Twitter Astro Babe and also a tender and a member of the pot um, in the Broom Discord. And the question, which is very small right now because it's several screenshots deep on my phone, came from a conversation about maintaining our own fire. And Adam said, quote, "Inner fire maintenance is a great Why Am I Like This topic in my opinion. I'd especially love to hear more from the daoish lineage perspective." And before I started recording, I asked the people who showed up live in the Broom Radio, which you can also do. If you look at the description of this episode, you should be able to find links that talk about joining the Broom Radio so you can join these sessions and other sessions live and also partake in conversations about cultivating inner fire and also like conversations about whether Brad Pitt or Harrison Ford is the better looking or better acting personality. You can also join us for conversations on the musical merits and entertaining merits of Nicki Minaj versus Megan Thee Stallion. But the question I asked to people who joined live is like, does anybody have any other questions relating to the topic of cultivating inner fire? And Anna, who's also a tender and probably a Twitter Astro babe as well, asked, how do you do it? Does anybody else have any I'll say like wood to add to the fire of this episode before I get into it and say my guarantee and all that kind of stuff? I'm curious to hear more about your experiences with Qigong or Qigong or Tai Chi, Adam, as well. I'm still holding space.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Not much experience. I'd say it was 4 or 5 sessions with my friend who has been studying it for like maybe 3 years, 2 or 3 years. And
how have those sessions been going?
Is practicing the art of teaching it with a friend, which is lovely.
Your audio is really a little choppy
lovely.
right now.
Like, I mean, first of all, it's amazing to connect with such an old friend in this way. And both like having this sort of the shared experiences that like, you know, the same phase in life, going to other cultures that let me see if I can still do it. Okay.
It could actually get better somehow. Yeah. I don't know what you do.
Took my headphones off. No, it's just been really amazing, and to have that experience with a friend, and I think through the sessions he was talking about that fire, that inner fire in the middle, Dantian, and I was reminded of something like some messaging about the inner fire from the Vedic tradition and lineages around the solar plexus and like the inner sun kind of language. And so I was really interested in this tradition's take on this idea of this fire that's in the stomach that wants to consume. And I really also appreciate what you were saying earlier about like tying it to the social media thing too. Like what are those things that you're getting energy from and feeding your fire with, right? And how that affects the whole operating.
I thought it was funny that like taking your headphones off improved the signal. It makes sense to me. Yeah, Hodo was asking, can you roughly define what you call inner fire, either of y'all? And it sounds like the practice that you've been working on is like middle dantian focus. Is that correct? Maybe? Or maybe it's sort of like, I want to say like ecumenical.
I'm not really. I would say we definitely have been more focused on the middle dantian and the jing, the lower part, right? Yeah. I'm probably getting the terms terribly wrong, but yeah, definitely lower body, a lot of hip stuff. But I mean, it's been really balanced. He's trying to just, he's at this stage, he's just kind of showing like a tapestry of like all of it for me.
That's great. Totally. I'm just kind of like looking at the containers in this container, which is apparently a container where I just use the word containers in like a pretty haphazard way, or in an, I'll say, ecumenical way, which is funny because, you know, that term to me comes from growing up in a Uniting Church school. But I feel like roughly it kind of refers to just being kind of like syncretic, or like having a big tent. I guess I'll, like, before I go on, I'll just like repeat my guarantee for why am I like this, which is that context will not be enmeshed within this container of space and time, or the space and time of anybody who listens to it, and context will be disenmeshed, and that I'll hold space for good faith disagreement or refinement of what I offer in this container. Not necessarily like what other people offer. I'll hold space more for my refinement and how I hold space for what other people offer. So y'all can breathe easily. Adam says the container store is Virgo coded for me. Yeah, that makes sense. I love the container store. I am very, like, my tropical sun is in Virgo. So that's pretty funny. It's funny. I mean, I'm going to get back to the topic, but I'll say, like, living with my mother right now, she's like one of those diasporic mamas who, like, basically never throws out a container, even if it's really shitty. It's like the container situation in this house is crazy. From like a physical perspective, like, we're talking cheap takeout containers from Vietnamese places. We're talking, like, you know, ramen containers from the chicken corner. Like, it's a mess. But I would say that my containers seem much more Virgo coded. My mom's also a Virgo, but we can talk about astrology later. So yeah, it was really interesting that you're talking about, like, maybe messing up the terms like Jing and middle Dantian and all that kind of stuff. And I guess, like, the first thing I kind of want to say on that stuff, from my perspective, which I think, like, you accurately labeled as a daoish perspective. And I feel like if you've been listening to Why Am I Like This before, then that might kind of make sense, because I've talked about, like, my spiritual education and my understanding of what Taoism is. And I would say, like, the traditions it came from, which I feel like are fairly accurate to call daoish. But yeah, going back to the terms you use, like Jing, and there's Chi or Ki, as they say in Hakka, and also as they say in Japanese. And there's like the middle Dantian. And, you know, I've kind of referred to the Dantians before as like seas, as in like bodies of water, but I usually spell it see as in to perceive something. Because in my traditions, which are, again, Tao-ish, these are also pools of perception. And what comes to mind is something that Bruce Lee said about water, right? Like, if water is still, you can see the reflection of the sky. And what my lineages tend to add to that is, if the water is still, you can often see to the bottom of the ocean. And I feel like that reflects both the ability to look at what I've called like astral realms, or you could say like realms of symbolic and conceptual knowledge, or collective realms of form and symbol and myth, clearly when the waters of our seas are still. But also, I would say that seeing to the bottom of the floor, or seeing at least clearly what obstructs our view of the floor of the ocean, or the floor of the sea, flow of the sea or the ocean, is about understanding the wisdoms of our ancestors, and also the karma or the trauma or the behavioral patterns of our ancestors, and how they inform the spirit or the mind or the psyche of our vessels in current time, and also past time, and perhaps, if you see really clearly, maybe future time as well. But to bridge this to Hoda's question, and eventually to Anna's question, but the Hoda's question about cultivating, or what is the inner fire, and then to Anna's question about how do you cultivate it, and also to situate all this within the container of Adam's question or his assertion of curiosity about cultivating inner fire from a daoish perspective or my daoish perspective. I'll say that, for me, it's usually instructive to look at the ideograms, especially in like traditional Chinese, for some of the terms that I find useful from the canon of traditional Chinese medicine, or from, I would say, like what I'm called to assemble symbolically and conceptually of the pre-conceptual shapes that I receive through my channel, which I talked about in an episode which was recorded on the 16th day of the second month of the 2024 year after Jesus is said to have been born. It's a loud truck going by, so I just paused for that. Which is to say that, I would say, like, when I talk about inner fire, I'm talking about qi. And I'd say, like, both the traditional and the simplified Chinese ideograms for qi connote pretty similar things. And then often I'll go back in time and look at, like, the seal script, which led to the traditional and then the simplified ideograms. And then sometimes I'll go back to the oracle bone script, which sort of tends to originate around like 500 BC. Or at least I would say like most of the artifacts we have of oracle bone script comes from around the period like 500 to like 200 BC. And that ideogram, which, I'm just going to like put a container in the container so y'all can scry it if that's something that you feel like doing or you feel like you can do, is often described as like the steam that comes off of cooked rice. And I'm aware right now that the semantic framework's a little wobbly, right? Because I've made a connection between inner fire and the steam which comes off rice. And you might be like, well, you need inner fire to cook rice so you can get steam. So how can you say the steam is also the inner fire? Does that make sense? Or does my articulation of the possible confusion make sense? Yes, Anna says yes.
Yes.
But I would say that I also trained as a mechanical engineer. I never became like a professional mechanical engineer or even like a non-professional mechanical engineer working in engineering companies, let alone like car companies. But I did have to learn about combustion engines and take them apart and clean them and put them back together. And I would say like a feature of most combustion engines is that the power that they produce goes back into preparing the fuel for consumption in the form of combustion, which creates more power. And that creates, I would say, like more appropriate combustion because the way that the fuel is prepared and then combusted depends upon the configuration of the engine. And, like there are engines which are two-stroke engines, there are engines which are four-stroke engines, there are engines with direct fuel injection, there are engines which take in fuel, which is like a powder, like diesel engines. There are engines which take in fuel in liquid form, and then the preparation of that fuel requires vaporization. And yeah, I would say like depending on the configuration of the engine and the fuel lines and all the things which come off of and feed into the engine, sometimes you need to go through phases of less efficient combustion in order to get to phases of more efficient combustion. And then I would say some engines have turbos associated with it. Most engines have flywheels, and then some engines also supercharge. Because I would say, like, when it comes to turbocharging and supercharging engines, we understand that air is also necessary for combustion, not just like diesel fuel or unleaded or leaded fuel, or even electricity if we're talking about electrical engines. And I'm not talking about electrical engines right now because I never studied them, and my understanding of how they operate is more from first principles versus experience. But to bring it back to inner fire and the idea of ki associating with inner fire for me, I would say that in this context, if we're talking about engines, ki is sort of like the momentum of the engine, and jing is fuel. So similar to combustion engines, I would say that jing has different forms, and some of those forms are like, I'll say, like the sex cells that our body produces. So there are like body cells and there are sex cells, loosely speaking, and sex cells are usually used to reproduce, right? Like our sex cells meet the sex cells of an opposite polarity, and then some magic happens, and then we produce like little babies, and they also have combustion engines. But I would say, like, from my daoish perspective, and I would say it aligns pretty well with the traditional Chinese medicine perspective, sex cells are considered to be like the purest form of fuel, in the sense that, like, it's fuel that only consists of the energy of our earthly ancestors and their DNA and their epigenetic markings, which I would say are like pretty highly coupled with the idea of ancestral karma, which is to say that the experiences of our ancestors, of course, like the experiences of our ancestors shape what DNA we have, right? Because, our ancestors chose to meet with our other ancestors and have babies, and they chose not to meet with other ancestors and have different babies, which wouldn't be us. But then I would also say that there's a decent amount of work which connects epigenetic markings on DNA with ancestral experiences. So that's why I'd say, like, the overlap between ancestral experience and epigenetic marking feels kind of like 80-ish% for me. So that's talking about, like, I'd say, like, in this context, I'll call it ancestral jing or ancestral fuel. And the burning of that fuel is often referred to as like ancestral chi or ancestral ki, which is to say that produces a certain momentum or a certain spiritual energy in the body. And then, yeah, you could also say that, like, oxygen is fuel, right? And of course, there are tons of like genetic material, not literal tons, colloquial tons of genetic material in the air that we breathe, like pathogens, bacteria, other forms of microbial matter, and that all goes into our body as well. And I would say that for most people, it's pretty hard to burn this fuel to produce ki, but obviously, like, we need a lot of the stuff in air in order to keep our bodies functioning so that we can burn all forms of jing to produce ki. And I would say that, without going too far into the details, because I want to answer this question in a way which feels aligned with my guarantee, I'll say that there's an energetic signature to the air that we breathe. And then, of course, there's food and water. And food, of course, has a bunch of genetic material. And food not only like feeds our body, but also feeds all of the other life forms that are in our bodies, like the microbes that consist our microbiomes. You could even say that, like, if you eat with your hands, you're probably more likely to feed the microbiome of your skin, because if you're like me and you eat with your hands, sometimes the food ends up on your hands, and then sometimes you end up touching your skin, and then the microbes are like, yum. And I would say that they also have little combustion engines, and those combustion engines also produce a form of momentum or ki. And I would say that the ki that our microbiome produces interacts with the ki that our body produces, which again is like very approximate, because the ways in which all of these fuels are taken apart and turned into like what we loosely call, quote, energy, unquote, is like really complex. But you can imagine that there's all forms of different jing, and they produce different forms of ki. And that ki has like an informational shape, and some of the ki in our body interacts with some of the other ki in our body in ways which could be considered like perfectly harmonious. And then some of it interacts in ways that could be considered partially harmonious. And then I'd say, like, there are lots of cases where the interactions between the ki that our body produces in some parts and the ki that other parts of our body produces, and the ki that's produced by the other bodies of other life forms that exist within our, I'll say, ecosystems, is very unharmonious. And it creates something which I'll just kind of refer to as inflammation. And I'll also name that this kind of addles the metaphor of inner fire even more, right? Because I think, like, the way that we've been using the term inner fire, I would say, is about doing something which maintains the health of our body and the ecosystem of our body, which contains many bodies of different life forms, which is to say, life forms which ontogenetically develop from different genetic material and epigenetic markings. However, when I bring in the topic of inflammation, I would say that for the most part, that's not something that in the moment that inflammation happens is generally for the health of the ecosystem of our bodies. I would say that inflammation can ultimately contribute positively to the health of our ecosystems. However, it usually only does so because the rest of the ecosystem of our body is functioning in a way that is able to take, I'll say, like, the rupture that causes inflammation and turn it into capacity and skill for dealing with further rupture. And I'll kind of cheekily addle the metaphor more by saying, like, in order to build a fire, and I'm talking about a good fire now, you don't just like drop a match on a log, right? And I've said this a few times before, but usually you need to like cause some kind of chemical rupture, which creates like a spark of some sort, or like energy moving very quickly from places of high potential to low potential. And that spark has to pass through material which is like light enough, or you could say has low chemical inertia, so that it can undergo a phase shift which requires like bonds to change their nature or break in that material, so that the energy of that material can be released. And to make it more concrete and like, I'll say, like, I'll say that, yeah, often you start a fire with like newspaper or dry leaves or spin effects or some kind of like low inertia material. And then you can add twigs, and then you can add like little dry branches, and then you can eventually add logs. And I would say in that same way, things that cause inflammation in our bodies can help us build the capacity to make goodness or health out of circumstances which would otherwise be unhealthy. But often, if our body does not have the skill or the capacity to make good things happen out of bad things, just to make it really simple, then those bad things can ultimately like lead us into downward spirals of health in our bodies. And I'm still trying to answer this question. But going back to what I was saying about momentum as key and Jing as fuel, I'll say that also our experiences can be Jing. And there's no like DNA in our experiences unless we're talking about eating or all the other things I talked about. But I would say that there is a genetic material to our experiences, in the sense that not only like from like a particularly like lay perspective, that our experiences can be generative and also inflammatory, and also generative in the inflammatory way which I outlined just now. But I would say like, yeah, I'll say right now that like our experiences are sort of like the Jing of the astral realm. And I would say that like probably like nobody's ever used the term astral key. But I'll say right now, and it might be confusing, and I want people to ask questions to clarify, but I'll say that like there is like what Chinese medicine refers to Jing as Jing, and there is what like Chinese medicine refers to as Qi. But what I'm referring to is a dynamic between fuel and momentum, which can be inducted upon, if that makes sense. So genetic material can be the Jing to the Qi that is like the momentum of our body to break down Jing. But also like experiences can be Jing to the Qi that I would say is like the spirit of our upper Si or our upper Dantian, which is I would say an astral realm which can connect to collective astral realms, which is to say that it's a world which is formed by the awareness which flows through the filters of thought forms, which are compositions of names, which we've talked about in the Shadow Way Book Club exegesis containers, but I feel like I've also talked about profusely in Why Am I Like This? And I would say names are doorways to realms which view reality from perspectives which are formed by thought forms or geometries of names. Which is to say that we have experiences, and then we can digest experiences with our brains, and we can digest experiences with the rest of our body. And then this shapes the way that we perceive reality. But this is not what most, this is definitely not what most daoish lineages would call key, but I'm just trying to outline a relative semantic framework which speaks to a dynamic of fuel and momentum. And then I'll say that what I'm kind of cheekily referring to as astral key tends to be referred to as shen or spirit. I would say like 70% in like westernizations of the traditional Chinese medicine canon. And then, yeah, like 30% in what I would feel fairly safe in calling like the traditional Chinese medicine canon itself, because there are a lot of people who refer to Shen in the same way that they refer to mind, which I feel like encompasses the overall spirit that animates a body. So to go back to this question, I would say for me, inner fire is, you could say, like the part of the spirit, but I would say like the subset of dynamics in the spirit which relate to producing momentum, which is used to digest fuel. And I would say, like, you could call it will. I don't think that would be completely accurate, but I'll just call it momentum, which allows us to, you could say, like, move through life and consume experiences and Jing and DNA and air and burn it in a way which is conducive to the health of our ecosystems. Not only the ecosystems of our individual separate physical bodies, but also in a way that helps us cultivate health in the ecosystems that we live in. But please disagree or add. I guess, like, while I'm holding space for that, I'll say that yeah, I think like at least like 60% of what I'm trying to transmit here is an understanding of like semantic framework flexibility. And I feel like this also gestures at something that we've referred to in many different The Broom Radio podcast episodes as namelessness, or which we sometimes refer to as geometries or codes, which hopefully, as you can see through like what I'm transmitting here, can find itself articulated and received and understood using many different names. And hopefully, one of the things y'all might glean from this transmission thus far is the importance of anchoring in namelessness so that we can understand people not just based on the words that they're using, but the underlying geometries of the words that they're using. And then at some level, the spirits which are emanating or projecting these geometries so that we can actually communicate. Instead of being like, oh, like you said inner fire, but like, then you said like Jing, but then like my framework calls ki prana, or, you know, my framework calls the spirit ruach. Like, you're wrong, I'm right. Your framework sucks. My framework rules. You have to use my words, otherwise you won't become enlightened, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to read something out from the chat. This says, I feel like momentum really fits because it feels more true to describing a flow of energy. Will, to me, in this instance, thank you for qualifying, would feel a little disjointed because will is like what happens or is expressed when momentum meets opportunity. Please disagree though. Woof! That's dope. I'm gonna meditate on that a little bit. But also, I'm guessing that disagreement invitation extends to anybody who's joining the container, live or not live, incarnate or disincarnate. I guess like what's coming to me when I like sort of, you know, receive this offering with two open hands and sort of like tilt my head this way and that way and sniff it, is that will kind of relates to like this spark, which is like necessary for burning something. And the spark itself comes from this momentum, like in combustion engines, and I would say like in the engines of our body, because our engines create this potential difference, right? Like there's parts of our body which have high potential, there's parts of our body which have low potential. I'm not talking about potential in the sense of like, one day you could go to Harvard and become a lawyer and then you could become president of the United States. I'm talking about like how water in a high place has higher potential energy than water in a low place. It doesn't mean the water in the low place is bad water. It just means that water from the high place falls to the low place. And then when it falls from the high place to the low place, it has more energy. So it goes from being high potential to low potential because water doesn't generally flow upwards unless we're talking about in containers where intense physical magic is being applied. Like, I've seen videos where like water flows uphill in places in Kenya because magicians have been working with those places for a long time. But going back to will and momentum, yeah, I would say that like in this context, like momentum is producing this flow of energy, and that flow exists because of places of high potential and low potential. And then an opportunity represents like a gap. And when we have enough momentum to make energy flow across that gap, and it produces a spark or an action or a way of experiencing the world, then I would call that will. But please disagree. Just reading some of the chat that I won't read out for now. Yeah, Anna's saying that Nova has said this about Sekhmet. Like I've talked about Sekhmet as being will as well, and I've also talked about how the crystallinity of the body allows for flow. And then, I'd say like will moves through that crystalline cipher, and then it finds parts of that cipher which are not crystalline. And that often, depending on the refinement of the vessel, sometimes that energy will flow into these impurities and cause us to see reality in certain ways. And sometimes it will cause us to act upon reality in certain ways. And I would say that energy flowing across those impurities relates to what you're talking about in terms of opportunity. And I'll liken it to like interactions between people by saying that I think that sometimes we'll like colloquially we'll say like, oh, like being with this person feels so connected, it feels so effortless. Like I don't even have to say what I'm thinking and they know. And I would say that like that's an example of a crystalline connection. But then I would say that if we have to like act or say something or interrupt something that we would do otherwise in order to maintain that connection, then that's an example of energy like moving across an impurity, not within our bodies, but within the body of, say, like collective human consciousness or the body of Earth in order to make that connection. And I would say that that's will. Oh, this says, I have a question forming around the connection of Isis, Hathor, and Sechem, but I'll add it to the why am I like this repository of questions. Thank you. That feels pretty juicy. Woof! I'm looking forward to encountering that question. So I guess I'll just like kind of tap you on the shoulder in the astral, Adam, and you, Hoda, as well, just to see if there's anything that y'all want to add or offer or would like me to clarify on the questions that y'all offered to the container. But I want to move on to Anna's question of like, how do you do it? Which is to say, how do you cultivate inner fire? But before I move on to it, I guess I'll ask Anna if there's anything that has moved for you with regard to the posture from which that question arose. Or to say it like a human being, I'll say like, has anything that I've said so far shed light on the darkness of the question?
So much, to be honest. Yes. Yeah, I'm not I'm not sure where to begin. But yeah, lots of things were firing.
It's like, it's so funny to me because it's like, I mean, it's funny to me for so many different reasons, but for one reason, I'll just be like, yeah, like you can see how, like, say in the Western system, or even I would say like in the Indo-European system, which gave rise to the Western system, you have like water, air, fire, and earth, and then you have ether. I think when you're talking about like the Indians, like the Indo-European system, and it's just like, yeah, like you can see how these elements combine to make meaning, but you can also see how they combine to like obscure meaning if we are anchored in names and we don't have an anchoring in namelessness. Um, because like we've invoked the term fire in like 15 different ways and like many of them conflict.
Oh my god, yeah. 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 Yes.
And then yeah, I was kind of like thinking about the container, that question within Adam's container. And yeah, like how do you do it? And I feel like there's so many different ways to talk about it. But I feel like one summary to extract from what I was saying from my perspective is like you live life and you live life in ways which either contribute directly to the health of your ecosystem, of your body, and or the ecosystems that you live in, or you live life in ways that cause you to experience things which help you to build skill and development for overcoming hardship. And you use your discernment and the discernment of other people to avoid experiences that cause the health of your system to degrade in ways that you and or the people around you can't help you to overcome in a way that builds your capacity to overcome hardship. Others like live, laugh, love, eat, pray. But I feel like that's like really glib, and it's not that glib's necessarily only bad, but I feel like glib is everywhere on social media. And this is not social media, or I would say like this is social media, and social media is not social media, which is to say that I would call this container a container which contains a social media, and I would say that the container of what we call quote social unquote media is actually parasocial. And I would say that it's very likely that people have experiences which do not contribute to the health of their system. And it's very likely that those experiences lead people into down spirals of health and not up spirals of health and the ability to overcome hardship. But yeah, please disagree is kind of implicit by like saying it anyway. But I think like to be more specific or more concrete about, like you live life and you try to have good experiences and you try not to have bad experiences that you can't recover from. I feel like, a dynamic that's pretty alive in the Broom is talking about hardships which we didn't have the support to overcome in ways that were generative, right? And people often talk about this as trauma. where, say like disruptions to the co-regulation and the nurturing that I would say like in healthy ecosystems we would experience not only from our parents but also from other people. Disruptions in that co-regulation can cause us to become avoidant or anxiously attached to the presence of other people, and that attachment can get in the way of our development and our ability to overcome hardship in ways that are generative. As an example, you could say that people often eat a lot of shitty food and it leads them into downward spirals of health. But I would say sometimes people eat shitty food and their body's like, cool, like now I can digest shitty food and that's going to make me digest really good food even better. And it's also going to make me digest shitty food better. And it's also going to help me digest shitty experiences better. And so on and so forth. And I would say, like, just as another plug for the Broom Radio, that sometimes the experiences that we have are too hard for us to overcome in given contexts. But then we find ourselves in contexts where we meet people who help us not only to have like the energetic and physical safety to touch back into those experiences, but also have the capacity and the skill to help us overcome those experiences so that, as I've said it before, and why am I like this? It's like we can like anneal or reintegrate particles of self or space and time which had become estranged from the rest of like what we consider to be ourself. Which is to say that on some scale of time, on some timelines, even things which were too difficult for us to overcome in a generative way in some period of time can become experiences which help us to become more skillful and high in capacity, not only for like burning up the fuel of our food and our experiences and our genetic material and our ancestral karma so that we become more powerful engines, but also so that we can help burn up the fuel of other people's experiences in ways that help them become more powerful engines, and I would say like contribute to the health not only of the ecosystems of our bodies, but also the ecosystems that our bodies interact in. There's an amazing Mike Tyson gif where he's playing with pigeons and asking them to kiss, but he's saying it like Mike Tyson says kiss. But yeah, I guess like, end plug, I'll say, not really end plug, but I'll say that practices which are sometimes referred to as like Qigong or like Tai Chi, or I'll say like dancing, can help us to get that fire started and to build that fire, right? So I don't think it's just about living life, but recently, I think he's a neuroscientist. His name's Eric Hill, Hoellerik. I think he had a tweet which went viral where he took a screenshot from a study about how different activities contributed to some measure of happiness. And dancing was like the far and away leader. And then like Qigong was there somewhere, yoga was there, exercise was there, exercise plus SSRIs, which are like chemicals that we use to regulate our nervous systems, or you could say regulate the biochemistry of our nervous systems. Like they were all kind of up there, but dancing was like really high. And I would say like, yeah, like I wouldn't say that what that measure of happiness measures is necessarily key, but I would say it's probably like 70% of key, given that I would say like the food that we tend to produce nowadays is a lot more digestible than the food that we used to eat. So I would say more of our ki nowadays is tailored towards and goes towards digesting experiences than it used to be, as a proportion. And happiness is definitely like a huge part of like the momentum that we need to digest experiences. I'm just meditating on all of these containers to see if there's anything else that wants to come through. I'll say like the only thing that wants to come through right now is that money is also key. In the sense that experiencing the receiving of money and being able to spend money allows us to digest our experiences, also allows us to buy fuel in the form of actual food, also allows us to buy material which helps us to stay out of the cold, keep the heat on. Also allows us to buy things that help us to become happy and produce more ki. And I'll say again, like, if you want to support Why Am I Like This or the Broom Radio, or even if you want to support somebody who has contributed to your ki in ways that helped you to digest the experience, which is not always easy, of being a human being, even if they're not asking you for money or holding something to your head to make you pay, then I would encourage you to help that money flow, whether it comes to me or if it comes to anybody else who helps to maintain the Broom Radio, or whether it's like someone I don't even know. But I would say that the dynamic that I've been transmitting upon in this episode also refers to the flow of money through the collective body of human consciousness, and also pertains to keeping that ecosystem healthy. And I would also say that many places that our money and our awareness goes probably leads to the production of ki, which is at odds with the ki that we need to keep our individual and collective bodies healthy. And I would say that discerning how we move energy, how we spend money, how we spend awareness, hopefully like through the lexical and non-lexical transmissions in this container, is something that we can all give our awareness to and refine our awareness through. And with that, I'll close the container and I'll say thank you for everybody who joined live. Thank you for everybody who offered their space and time and their questions and their assertions of curiosity to this container. I'll do the things, but if anybody has any follow-up reflections, then please feel free to share them in the thread I created for this episode, or anywhere in the Broom Radio Discord, or even on social media, parasocial media, whatever you want to call it. It's good with me. I do feel like there's more to answer on this question, so I've left it pinned in the channel because I think I'll come back to it. But for me, I feel really good about this transmission. I thank y'all again. Listen to the Broom Radio. Peace.